As well as this adventure had begun, it was now starting to unravel. His aim had probably been to capture Constantinople before Constantius left the east. But then the real heavy news dropped. Constantius had made a deal with the Sassanids, and was already marching west. Bottled up in the middle of the empire with his supply lines to Gaul cut off, and political support non-existent, Julian was looking doomed. What he needed was a miracle. Then, in November of 361, a miracle. Constantius and his army had made it as far as the Cilician gates, when the emperor came down sick. Unwilling to stop, he ordered the army to press on, but by the end of the next day, the shocking news began to spread. Constantius II was dead. He was 44 years old, and had been in Augustus for 24 years. Following right on the heels of this shocking news was the even more shocking news that despite the fact that they were about to fight each other to the death, Julian was still listed in Constantius's will as the sole and rightful heir to the empire. So now, far from having to fight his way to Constantinople, the road to the capital was wide open. Julian, who had been raised a forgotten exile, was now the sole ruler of the Roman Empire. Next week, we will see what he does now that he wields so much power. And I'll give you a hint. It has something to do with why we call him Julian the Apostate. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 145, Julian the Apostate. In November of 361 AD, Constantius II died, and Julian, last of the Constantinians, inherited the empire. It would be an ironic end to the dynasty. At least, I'm pretty sure it's ironic. Sometimes I think that no situation actually fits the technical definition of irony, and that the word just sort of hangs out in the linguistic ether singing a siren song that's designed to crash the unsuspecting against the jagged rocks of pedantry. But I'm pretty sure it's ironic. Constantine began the dynasty by single-handedly launching Christianity to prominence, and his nephew would end it by attempting to single-handedly turn back the clock and bury Christianity. That's ironic, right? It sure seems ironic, but it's probably just interesting. When Julian received word that his cousin was dead, I have to imagine that it took a few minutes for the news to sink in. Here he was, hunkered down in Thrace and ready to make what was very possibly shaping up to be his last stand. And instead, Constantius is dead, and I am now emperor. Like an approaching hurricane that just sort of transforms at the last moment into a pleasant sunny day, it takes a second to fully appreciate what the heck has just happened. But after the first few minutes of blinking wonder passed, Julian wasted no time completely embracing his imperial windfall. It appears that he had been thinking for a while about what he would do if he became emperor, because as soon as he became emperor, Julian jumped right into a completely out-of-left-field program of reform with both feet. Many critics of the new emperor note, though, that while his enthusiasm is laudable, maybe Julian should have looked before he leaped. Now the unopposed master of the empire, Julian entered Constantinople on December the 11th, 361 AD, and immediately got down to it. The first order of business, of course, was to completely overhaul the imperial court. Stalking the halls of the palace were men who were not just venal and corrupt, but men who had actively opposed Julian. Men who had consistently tried to talk Constantius into killing him. These men needed to be identified and purged. Aware that it might look bad if he just showed up and started arbitrarily killing people, Julian gave his purge the air of objectivity by appointing an independent commission of 6 trusted men to sort through the roles and separate the good men from the bad men. The emperor even went so far as to situate this commission across the Sea of Marmara in the town of Chalcedon, so that the verdicts would not originate from the imperial palace itself. But I doubt that anyone was too fooled by this superficial independence. The worst of the emperor's enemies were executed, and the rest were exiled. It wasn't hard to see the invisible hand of Julian guiding the commission's decisions about who needed to go and who could stay. But beyond the strictly personnel decisions, the commission also included among the guilty men who were just plain old bad eggs. Constantius's court had a reputation for corruption, and the idealistic Julian appears to have been genuinely interested in purging the imperial rolls of the worst of the worst. But Julian was not done when the commission wrapped up its business. For all the attention his religious policies receive, religious policies that we'll get to in a minute, it is worth noting that Julian was not just trying to turn the clock back on the church. He was also trying to turn it back on the state. Julian clearly idolized the emperors of the Antonine dynasty, and sought to base his own administration on their example. The first thing he attacked was just the sheer bloat of the imperial court. The Golden Age emperors had not needed a personal barber, so why did he? Pink slips started flying through the palace, and anyone deemed unnecessary, redundant, or useless was simply given the boot. But firing all the leeches was just the beginning of Julian's attempt to turn back the clock to the hundreds AD. In a far more dramatic and far more disruptive move, the emperor also began to abandon the whole emperor as a living god conceit. He shed the massive smokescreen of officials standing between him and his subjects. He ate simple foods and wore simple clothes. He grew a philosopher's beard. Clearly, Julian wanted to pretend like the epoch-shifting reforms of Diocletian had never happened, and return to the princeps model of governance. In Julian's head, these were virtuous reforms that would be embraced by a public weary of overblown imperial egos. But mostly, the public was just bewildered. It would have been like Vespasian emerging from the civil wars of 69 AD and suddenly announcing that the Republic was back in effect. No one would have had any idea how to act, how to deal with it, or what was even expected of them. The entire political system of the late Empire was centered around a quasi-divine emperor who inhabited the realm between man and God. To have an emperor suddenly joining in Senate debates, expressing emotion in public, and just sort of generally being around, well, it was massively disconcerting. Julian meant well, but his vision was hopelessly anachronistic. When he died, the mere mortals of the empire gratefully ran back into the paternal embrace of their once again quasi-divine emperor. While he was bringing the role of emperor back down to earth, Julian also attempted to reduce the public power of the imperial bureaucracy in general. Adopting a more Trajan-like worldview, Julian believed that the central government was there to focus on the big picture issues like defense and taxation. It was not there to micromanage the affairs of every city, town, hamlet, and farmhouse in the empire. Seeking to devolve political authority, Julian re-empowered the ruling councils of the cities and handed over jurisdiction of huge tracts of imperial land to these local magistrates. The idea was to get them involved in the decision-making process, so Julian himself was not bogged down by endless minutiae. But once again, the citizens of the empire were more bewildered than anything else. Had Julian lived longer, this might all have eventually sunk in. But in the year and a half he ruled, he mostly just spun his wheels, trying to convince the leading men of various cities that being a magistrate wasn't just a massive financial burden anymore, that real power and real authority was theirs for the taking. They remained skeptical, though, until Julian's death ended the argument, and the rich and powerful men of the empire continued their drift into rural feudalism undisturbed. To the energized 29-year-old emperor, however, these reforms were not yet doomed to failure, and he really felt like he was just getting started on a complete overhaul of the empire's political constitution. He had no way of knowing that because he was about to die, none of this was going to stick. We don't really have any idea what would have happened had Julian lived, and it is one of the great speculative questions of Roman history. Maybe the institutional barriers would have been too great to overcome in the end, but then again, maybe 30 years of Julian really would have been revolutionary. Which brings us to the heart and soul of Julian's short reign. The heart and soul of Julian the Apostate. As I mentioned 2 episodes back, Julian had secretly rejected Christianity around 350 AD, not long after being released from his Cappadocian exile. But until now, this rejection had been a behind closed doors sort of thing. Close friends and advisors were aware of Julian's religious preferences, but since there was no upside to publicizing these religious preferences, it was a secret that stayed with his close friends and advisors. Now that he was king of the hill, though, Julian was free to bring his paganism out into the open, and boy did he ever bring it out into the open. From the minute he became emperor, Julian worked obsessively to tear down the socio-political influence of the Christians, or, as Julian liked to call them, the Galileans, a subtle dig based on a quote from the Gospel of John, that out of Galilee ariseth no prophet. But Julian knew that merely tearing down would not be sufficient to fulfill his vision of a re-paganized empire. He would also have to build something up to replace these soon-to-be displaced Christians. When Julian entered Constantinople in December of 361, he immediately began this dual program of tearing down Christianity and building up paganism. It goes without saying that the political purge that accompanied Julian's arrival in the capital was driven in part by religious motives. In other words, the Christians were to be kicked out of influential posts, denied access to the imperial purse strings, and denied access to the emperor personally. Since the previous regime of Constantius had been so overtly Christian, though, this basically meant getting rid of everyone, something even Julian found he couldn't bring himself to do. So the apostate emperor wound up retaining a handful of the most honest and capable Christians in his administration. Beyond these token few, though, if you were Christian, your civil service career was suddenly in jeopardy. Now, of course, the swiftness with which Julian was able to reorganize the inner circle of the imperial government could not be matched on a system-wide basis. The bureaucracy was simply too large and too dispersed to overhaul overnight. But Julian was taking the long view on this thing, and so he promulgated a discriminatory order that when jobs opened up, the God-fearing preferred over the atheists, that is, the Christians. For the ambitious civil servant, this had to be a frustrating development. Like a week ago, they told me I had to be Christian if I wanted this job, and now you're telling me that because I'm a Christian, I'm not going to get the job? I don't really care one way or the other. I just wish you guys would get your story straight.